Welcome back. I'm very glad to have you here for the second day of the class after we got through all that administrative stuff on the first day of the class. I'm Professor Nicholas Sterling, and I'm very glad that you are joining us for Classic 396, Myths of Rome. And so, for this first real class day, we're going to start off talking about the first of our seven authors that you will be reading for this class. The first one is Catullus. And as you see from his dates, Catullus dates from the 1st century BC, and as we will cover in more detail in future videos, he in fact dates from the very end of the Roman Republic and very close to the beginning of the Roman Empire, although he did not actually live long enough to see the Roman Empire come around. So, Catullus, as you either have seen or will see with his number 64 poem, was a poet who implemented a lot of meters that were relatively new for the Romans at that time. He borrowed, as in fact the Romans did frequently, many of these meters directly from the Greeks, especially during Hellenistic times. We'll talk about more of that in a bit. And was able to convert those into Roman poetry in the Latin language. So Catullus was in fact one of the first poets to make this transfer from Greek literature to Roman literature, and was one of the most successful in his day. It does not appear, however, that his success with poetry mirrored too much success with his own personal life. He obviously did not live for very long, and it appears from the tone of his poetry that he had quite a tough time with love, specifically this lady whom he called Lesbia. But more on that in a little bit. I would like you first to pause the video and please go to Sakai and locate the first of the 7 handouts under Resources, which is in regards to this poet Catullus. Please pause your video and open the first of the 7 handouts, handout number 1. Okay, have you located that handout? Excellent. So now we're going to go to the content of the handout and the specifics about Catullus himself. Now, as it happens, we do not know very much about Catullus's own bio. As I say, he did live quite a short life, and we just simply do not have very much information to go on. He does not appear to have been active at any time in Roman politics, other than having served in Bithynia, and apparently not especially successfully. He appears to have spent most of his life in Rome after he was born in Verona to a very distinguished family. It appears that he was on the staff of that governor from 57 to 56 BC, so that would have been near the end of his life as we know it. Otherwise, he appears to have devoted most of his time to poetry. The only thing we do know as far as the content of his poetry is that, aside from what we actually have in his surviving works, is that he apparently did not get along very well with Gaius Julius Caesar, and apparently attacked him, denounced him out in public, but then eventually reconciled. Beyond that, though, all we can really discern about Catullus is from the contents of his works themselves. So the works themselves are called Carmina, and that is the Latin word for poems. You should be aware that the singular in Latin of this word is carmen, C-A-R-M-E-N. The plural is carmina. So all of the works that you have in your textbook of Catullus are referred to by the Latin name of Carmina. And the one that you are reading for this course is number 64, which is, as it turns out, is the longest of the group. So the Carmina come in 3 general groups. The first is shorter poems of a whole parcel of different meters. The second are the longer poems from 61 to 68, longer than all the other ones on either side. And finally, the poems from 69 on to the end are referred to as elegiac poems because the particular meter that's used is the one referred to as elegiac. It's very similar to another meter we're going to talk about in a future video called dactylic hexameter. which basically goes bum 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 bum, which is the one that is used by Virgil when he composed Aeneid, and by Ovid when he composed Metamorphoses. Elegiac is similar to that meter, except that it has an extra line in it with a somewhat different beat. And we'll talk later about Ovid. He also wrote quite a few poems in the elegiac meter, although his masterpiece, Metamorphoses, is in the hexameter meter. So for Catullus, all the poems from 69 on are in the elegiac meter. Now, some noteworthy characteristics of these particular works. First of all, much of Catullus's poetry can be traced back to the fragments that we have of Hellenistic literature. Now, in the Greek world, the period from 480 to 322 BC, 322 BC being the death of Alexander the Great, is referred to as the classical period of Greece. Then from 322 on to 146 BC, the period after the death of Alexander the Great, is called the Hellenistic period. Then from 146 on, of course, Greek culture is subsumed under Roman culture after the conquest of the city of Corinth in 146 BC. And from that point on, Greek culture ceases to be independent in the ancient sense, and becomes a part of the Roman Republic and then eventually the Roman Empire. So the Hellenistic period, therefore, is that almost 2 centuries, about 180 years, of the final phase of Greek history before it comes under Roman influence. We will talk about that in the next video when we cover Roman history in a quick scheme. But a lot of the Hellenistic literature we have shows a lot of attention paid to a specific genre as to the way that an author should go about writing that specific genre. So for instance, philosophy, epic poetry, lyric poetry, hymns, many different kinds of literature. Also quite a bit done now with both tragedy and comedy that we'll refer to from time to time in later videos. Hellenistic poetry has a more scholarly attention paid to the type of literature that it's aiming to compose. That reflects that the great library and museum and school at Alexandria, Egypt, was in full swing at this time. And much of the efforts made to preserve older pieces of literature from the archaic and classical times now is going on. There were efforts made to reconstruct texts, because many of the texts were not, in fact, given to us by the original ancient authors from centuries before that period. And many of those were stored at the Alexandrian Library, which unfortunately eventually burned, and so we lost a lot of the records that it had. But and that includes quite a bit of the Hellenistic literature. So we know that this is the period whose literature influenced a lot of the Roman authors in their efforts to write literature after the manner of the Greeks. Again, something that we will speak more about in future weeks. So Catullus has poetry that follows a lot of those models as far as poetry goes, the type of work written, and also meters that are used for the poems, and of course the topic is going to be based quite a bit on the Greek influence. But again, it's important to understand that the reason we are distinguishing Hellenistic is that prior to the Hellenistic period, most of the literature we have appears to have been spontaneous, written for specific occasions, and not necessarily in the interest of preserving anything particularly for the future. There was some of that, as for instance with the historians like Thucydides, who tried to do that. But for the most part, works were simply composed at the time and may or may not have been put down to writing. But many manuscripts that we have of these works come from quite a few centuries later. Very little, except for some fragments, survives from that particular time. So, therefore, the Hellenistic time, with the effort of getting things into writing, is in fact the first period in which we see very specific efforts to make sure that things are preserved. And so that's one of the reasons why that's the natural time for Catullus to be influenced by that period. Another thing about the Hellenistic period is that it was a time of a great deal of experimentation with different genres, different ways of tweaking the genres, trying new things. trying out sometimes rather satirical ways or just simply avant-garde or experimental ways of imaginatively varying the established genres in different ways. And so that kind of experimentation of trying to see how poetry could work is something we see quite a bit of with Catullus. So elegiac meter, as we mentioned, specifically refers to the meter that is similar to dactylic, except that it has a different meter every other line, very similar to the dactylic, but a little bit shorter. Elegiac meter, as its name suggests, originally was used for epithets that were placed on gravestones, what we call stelae, from the Greek. They would be short 2- or 4-line poems in honor of the deceased at that particular grave site. And elegies, therefore, were for the most part used for these very short poems that would simply offer some type of commemoration. In time, though, elegiac meter was expanded to be used and incorporated into written poetry, and that meant that it could now be used for many different themes of interest to the different authors. As it turns out, the one that elegiac came to be associated with most frequently was love. But by no means was elegiac meter restricted specifically to love poetry. That's just the poetry that we end up having the most of, and which becomes the most commonly associated with elegiac poetry. So Catullus's third group of poems from 69 on are the ones written in that particular elegiac meter. Now, the topics for Catullus's poetry are quite wide-ranging, and a lot of times are either salacious or very harshly critical. Catullus appears to have had some very acerbic points of view on Roman literature and culture in general, on certain Roman figures like Cicero or Caesar in particular, and also on any person whose personal habits or social leanings or political ambitions Catullus took exception with. And if he had a negative opinion about a certain person, he did not mince words in describing to that person exactly what he thought of them. So some of the poems are very smutty, with words that oftentimes cannot be translated directly into the English language because they are basically bleep words when they show up. So if you want to see some of that, you can read the rest of the Catullus book outside of poem number 64 to see the depth to which Catullus will go in criticizing somebody. But that said, what we do get a sense of from Catullus is that a lot of the people with whom he converses in these poems appear to have been other poets or other people very closely interested in literature. So it appears that in Roman society, not too different from Greek society, there would have been only a relatively few people in the population who would, first of all, be literate enough to read and write at all, but also be intelligent or scholarly enough to be able to handle the rather advanced work of understanding literature and examining it and seeing how poetry was written and so forth. And so Catullus was probably writing his poetry for a small literary poetic circle of people who shared like interests with him. We know that that's definitely true later with Ovid, because Ovid had two other poets, Tibullus and Propertius, with whom he appears to have treated elegiac poetry experimentation. So Catullus frequently addresses these poems or other specific figures. Sometimes, if they're friends, he'll write sort of jocular kind of poetry, conversational. If the person is not a friend, somebody that Catullus doesn't like, then he gets a great deal more vicious in the things that he wants to say. Now, overarching the whole thematic framework of such as it is of Catullus's Carmina is this shadowy figure, Lesbia. Now, it is a common trope in Hellenistic poetry for a male poet to be smitten madly in love with some woman who is inaccessible for whatever reason. One frequent reason why she may be inaccessible is that she may be on a social plane much higher than the poet. She may be wealthier than him and therefore not likely to pay much attention to him. And of course, there may be the awkward problem that she may be married. That's not going to stop any poet who wants a particular woman. So, if a poet had a particular love interest in mind, he would assign a pseudonym to that particular person, such as Cynthia or Delia, or some other name that would become distinguished for that particular poet. So in Catullus's case, it's Lesbia. Lesbia is quite an interesting name because it harkens back to the island of Lesbos, which was indeed an island that was occupied mostly by women, and indeed the relationships were of the lesbian type that we think of today. And there was among them a woman poet named Sappho from ancient Greek times, and many of Catullus's poems are based directly, either in topic or in meter, sometimes both, on Sappho's plays. The very first poem that we believe, number 51 in the book, that we believe Catullus wrote to address this woman was in fact almost a copy of a famous poem that luckily survives to us from Sappho's poetry, except that Catullus makes a few important switches in the theme that he states when he writes this poem for this particular woman. Now, exactly who Lesbia was, we can't exactly be sure. We have one suspicion, though, that she is a lady named Clodia, C-L-O-D-I-A, whose brother Clodius was a prominent and rather violently minded politician. There was, in fact, a very harsh incident eventually between Clodius and another noted politician named Milo, in which eventually Clodius ended up dead in that particular election. Basically, the election descended into fighting among street thugs. And Milo was in fact put on trial. Cicero tried unsuccessfully to defend him and was eventually convicted of the murder of Clodius. So Clodia might have been a woman of very high social standing, but of very questionable morals, and not the kind of woman who would look out sympathetically for some poet. So it's therefore not likely, if Lesbia really was Clodia, that Catullus had very much success in trying to attract her to him. In any event, the love affair between Catullus and Lesbia, if there actually was one, clearly did not go well. It starts, as we said, with number 51. It goes through a whole series of other poems up and down where Catullus loves Lesbia and is being ignored by her and doesn't want to have anything more to do with her. At one point, Lesbia has a bird. That's poem number 2. And then the bird dies, poem number 3. And Catullus has tried to comfort her, sort of, basically tried to tell her, get over it, it's just a bird, and so on. But finally, you should check out poem number 11. That is the one that is the only other poem in the collection that is written in the same meter as that original poem number 51. And that is Catullus's very harsh farewell, definitely permanent, to Lesbia. He finally has had completely enough with her. Evidently, she had a lot of friends, some of whom are also addressed by other poems in Catullus with not very kind words. And so Catullus finally dismisses Lesbia completely after all these ups and downs in poem number 11. Okay, so we will talk about poem number 64 in more detail in a later video as we start to connect our Roman literary writers with the history of the times in which they were composing. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk more about Roman literature and Roman history. We'll see you next video.